problem because it causes third-party exploitation by pimps and traffickers. But what we know is that sex buying itself is a problem, regardless of whether there's a third-party exploiter or trafficker, because it's an abuse of power and because it exists on a continuum of sexual violence. You know, and some of it's the most overt, worst kind of violence you can imagine. If you think of serial murderers, guy we had out in Seattle way was named Gary Ridgway and killed 90 women over the course of 20 years. And he targeted people in prostitution. And it was no accident. It was really specific targeting of people in prostitution because he thought he could get away with targeting people. And he did for a long time. And then we have, people who commit really egregious acts of violence against people in prostitution. And, we've all got the statistics and seen the statistics that show all of this. But I want to take the conversation a little further and say, let's interrogate a little further this idea of sex buying per se, and take a look at what that's about. I've worked with sex buyers over 30 years, and it's very easy for them to be able to say, well, I didn't know about those horrific forms of violence, so I'm not going to participate in buying sex anymore because I don't want those bad guys out there hurting women. That's not what accountability looks like. Real accountability would be to recognize your own abuse of power and your own place on that continuum of sexual violence. It's a great example of this. Years ago in Seattle, I met a man for coffee who had self-referred to our sex buyers class, right? So we would get guys every now and then, not sent by the courts, who would call me up and say, can I come to the class? And so I'd go and meet them and then, get them set up with a class. And so when I met this particular guy, we sat down together, and the first thing he said when we sat down was, Peter, thanks for meeting with me. I just want to let you know I'm a good John. And I looked at him and said, okay, tell me more. And he said, I'm a good John. I never hurt the girls physically. And then he continued and said, and I never hurt the girls emotionally. And then he stopped himself and he said, well, I'm not quite sure if I hurt them emotionally or not, because it's like when you look in their eyes, it's like they're not even there. It's like they have a mask on or something. And so my question to him was, what part of this other person being dissociative told you it was a great time to go ahead and have sex with her? What part of her not being there, having to kind of literally leave her body in order to get away from this experience, told you that this was about consent and mutual sexual activity? And this is a good John. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about sex buying being an abuse of power and existing on a continuum of sexual violence. When I further asked this guy if he would have had sex with somebody who wasn't in prostitution if she had exhibited similar sorts of behaviors, he said no. And when I asked him why, he said, because women in prostitution are different. They're in a different category, different rules apply. And so I think that if we're going to look at what we know about gender equality and about sexual activity and consent, that we need to look at sex buying itself as problematic. If I've learned anything from the Me Too movement over the past few years, it's that sexual activity should never be a condition of employment. If quid pro quo sexual harassment creates inequality in the workplace, prostitution creates inequality in the world, right? And so, and I think so often in anti-trafficking work, the conversation gets bogged down in, well, does some individual who's being exploited choose to be exploited? Is there a third-party exploiter? Is this empowering? Is there agency there? And I think we need to be able to pivot and ask a new question and to look squarely at the issue of the buyer's agency and the buyer's entitlement and the buyer's accountability for driving the harm that occurs in systems of commercial sexual exploitation. So this is the approach that's at the root of the 10-week sex buyers intervention program that we have. And sex buying is a problem. It's definitely a problem for people who are exploited. It's also a problem for other people in the lives of buyers. Buying sex has been associated with men's perpetration of gender-based violence, including physical and sexual violence against intimate partners, perpetration of rape against both partners and non-partners. College-age men who used women in prostitution committed more sexually coercive behaviors than men who had not. And internationally, when we look at men who buy sex, they're more likely to perpetrate rape. And I like to get this out there because I think that there's this um, uh, myth out there that somehow, unless prostitution exists, that men are going to rape other people who aren't in prostitution, right? That they're going to somehow that it's meeting this need. There's some sort of catharsis. But what we know is if somebody is able to objectify and dehumanize a woman in prostitution, he's equally able to do it to other people in his life. And so being able to tackle the issue of prostitution as we talk about intimate partner violence and sexual assault and sexual harassment is important because it's the same guys that do these things. And who are they? How many of them are they? This is a tough question. It's not been a long time that there's been really great data on it. Some of the recent data that I think is exciting came out of a study last year from Demand Abolition, which looked at, I think, over 8,000 men in the US. And what they found was that of men living in the US, 80% have never bought sex. So most men don't buy sex. Of the 20% who have ever bought sex, only 6% bought sex in the past year. So it's about 6% of adult men in the United States that are buying once a year or more. And so this is, may seem like not a lot, but when you think of the population of, your city or your state and take 6% of that, it's a pretty significant number. And it's not just about the men who buy sex either. And I think Vince spoke to this earlier in saying that what happens often is it sets a norm about what's tolerable in the treatment of others. How many of those 80% of men who have never bought sex would say, I've never bought sex because I don't have to, or I've never bought sex because I wouldn't do it, but it's okay for somebody else to do it. So this isn't like 80% of the men who don't buy sex get it and are kind of actively working to stop forms of gender-based violence and inequality, and to engage other men in that work. And so when we're thinking of targeting populations, I think it's important, yes, to look at that white piece of the pie where the 6% of more high frequency sex buyers are, but we need to kind of look at the whole population and be able to tackle everyone and take that all on. Another thing that came out of that same demand abolition study was that 64% of sex buyers, men who self-identified as sex buyers, either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, I would like to stop buying sex. Now, this is often surprising to people, that such a large portion of men who buy sex want to stop. And I think that it's important to ask the question, because what's the logical question that comes out of this is, well, why are they buying sex then if 64% want to stop? What is this about? And I think the place people initially want to go to is one of, well, it's got to be a addiction or some sort of compulsive behavior. Well, that may be true for a small minority of people, of men who buy sex. They're still targeting people in prostitution with this behavior. And for most, 5 out of 6, it's really not an issue of addiction or compulsion. It's more an issue of entitlement and access and lack of accountability. And so why do men buy sex? Well, I've got a couple of quotes from men who came through my class that I think sum it up pretty well. Here's one guy, when I asked him why I bought sex, said, I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. So I think that was a really thoughtful, reflective way to talk about it. And it's really similar to this next guy who said, I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. Now, how's that the same? I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. Well, when I asked this guy further, I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. What do you mean? Why do you hate women? He said, well, I hate women because I was with one of them for 15 years. And then she left me and took half of everything I had. And I'm never going to trust another one of them again. And I said to him, oh, you're hurt. You feel betrayed. And you have no idea how to grieve. And so you're gonna, instead of processing your stuff, you're gonna amplify it and project it onto half of humanity and target them with violence in order to make yourself feel not vulnerable and feel more like a man there. And it's never gonna help you meet the relational needs that you really need fundamentally to get met. You know? And so I think that this is prostitution. This is sex buying. I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. That this is fundamentally what it's about. And, you know, I should say at this point too, that it's not only women who are exploited in systems of commercial sexual exploitation. Boys, trans people, sometimes men are exploited in these systems as well. But if we look at who it is that's doing the buying, it's almost exclusively men. You know, there's enough exceptions to prove the rule, but even less than in domestic violence or sexual assault, sex buyers are almost exclusively men. And there's an eroticized power imbalance between the person who's paying and the person they're buying, right? And the entitlement to act out on their bodies in this way, regardless of the gendered nature of the person who's being exploited, it serves to assuage the gendered of the dominant person who's buying the sex, right? That's a function of it. You know, and why does it happen? I think Bell Hooks said it really well. She said, most men think that sex will provide them with a sense of being alive, connected, that sex will offer closeness, intimacy, pleasure. More often than not, sex simply does not deliver the goods, but this does not lead men to cease obsessing about sex. It intensifies their lust and their longing. And the lie that gets held out to boys and men in this culture is that we can get our relational needs met through non-relational sex. You can't get there from here. In order for relational needs to get met, you need to be in relation with somebody. And it's not about like, and that requires some risk and the ability to connect with another person and the ability to love and the ability to feel. And these are all the things that so many boys are taught to cut away from ourselves at such an early age. And so these are really the fundamental kind of like building blocks that SSE is built on. And so, so quick history of sex buyers programs and the development of SSE. I got started on this issue, you know, around 30 years ago. There were very few sex buyers that were being arrested. When we got started in '95 in Portland at that initial program that I started there was one other program in the country that started the same month that we did, actually. We weren't aware of each other. But it was run by a survivor service organization out of San Francisco called SAGE, Standing Against Global Exploitation, which was a group run by Norma Hoteling. And they created the one-day John School. And that pretty quickly became the go-to model around the country. And it's important to point out that this was a really important development, because what it did at that time was it started to introduce the idea that maybe we should focus on the buyers and maybe they can be a target of education efforts. But really at that time, we had no data about buyers. There had been very little research done. There was very little understanding of this as an abuse of power, an issue of violence, or any of the things I'm talking about today. And so it was a good step in the right direction. Unfortunately, what's happened in the intervening years is that many municipalities around the country have continued to just stick with the one-day model. When I was starting an organization for prostitution survivors in Seattle in around 2012, we were awarded a multi-year grant from a group called Demand Abolition that was based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I was given the opportunity to kind of work to develop a new model of sex buyers intervention. And that is what became the Stopping Sexual Exploitation, a program for men. One of the things that I had done the year before, serendipitously, was worked with the researcher, Dr. Melissa Farley. And we did a research study, and looked at men who bought sex, 100 men who bought sex in Boston, compared them with 100 who did not, and came up with some interesting data an analysis that I think really drove the work that I did in the subsequent development of the SSE curriculum and process. Because we were finding out, what we were finding out with buyers didn't indicate the one-day approach or the John School approach. You know, what we found out was what I had been learning from working with buyers over a long period of time. You know, in this study, we found out that sex buyers were ambivalent about what they did. They had negative thinking about their buying sex. As we saw in the demand abolition study too, that they felt just as many negative feelings about buying sex after as they did before, right? Can't get the relational needs met through non-relational sex, obviously. Many sex buyers sought sex that lacked emotional connection. They had little objection if the woman they purchased pretended to like them or actively disliked performing the act of prostitution. And sex buyers commented that they liked the power relationship in prostitution and that they liked the freedom from any relationship obligation, right? So this is all what we've just been talking about. And it was confirmed by this research in Boston. We also know that both buyers and non-buyers evidenced extensive knowledge of the physical and psychological harms of prostitution. That 2/3 of both the buyers and the non-buyers observed that a majority of people in prostitution are lured or tricked into it. And many of the men had an awareness that the economic coercion and the lack of alternatives in women's entry in prostitution, right? So they knew that almost all of the places in Boston where people were available for prostitution, that there were children available in those locations as well. The knowledge that they had that these women had been exploited, coerced, pimped, or trafficked did not deter the buyers from buying sex. Many of the sex buyers had used women who were controlled by pimps at the time they used her for sex. They knew they were pimped. And they seemed to justify their involvement in the sex industry by stating their belief that women in prostitution are essentially different from non-prostituting women. Again, you can see how all of this is what connects with what we've been talking about so far. We also see both sex buyers and non-sex buyers subscribing to the theory that prostitution reduces the likelihood of rape, which we know is untrue. And then although half of the study's sample did not buy sex, many of them were tolerant of prostitution for men who did. So these findings suggest that efforts to deter sex buyers should expand their focus solely from men who buy sex to the general public attitudes that support prostitution. This is the norms-based approach that I think is an important issue to talk about. But, and I'll dive in just a minute in talking about how that guided the development of SSE. But I think that what it speaks to is this, inability that we had really early on in being able to see that participants, buyers knew. They knew about the harm. They knew about the exploitation. They knew about that there were children involved. They knew that there was pimping that was happening. They knew all these things. And so if you're thinking about creating a program where what you're going to do is expose the reality of the nature of this form of exploitation, that's not going to be really effective because they know already. You know, as one buyer said once when I was talking to him, he said, yeah, I knew, I just wasn't thinking about it at the time. We got to address this dissonance, like that's operational within these guys, for them to be able to say, yeah, I know, and you know what, I don't care. I'm entitled to do this anyway, because I don't see this other person as fully human. So here's what a buyer said. He said, I feel it's simple, really. If you're paying someone, then it can't really be a free choice. They don't want to be with a bunch of dumpy middle-aged guys like us. It's exploitation, pure and simple. I didn't want to see that before. Another one said, to be honest, I don't think that anything else would have stopped me. I needed the arrest to make me take a look at myself and what I was doing, right? So the arrest is really important. But we need more than the arrest. This is the other guy says, the arrest stopped me. I would have never bought sex again, but the program taught me why I should never buy sex again, right? And this is a really key person. You know, in my opinion, you know, sex, just the arrest is going to stop men for a significant amount of time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. They're not going to buy sex again until something goes wrong in their life, until something else happens, and they're far enough away from the event and they haven't learned their lesson. So this is why I think it's really important to get them to put meaning, that they're not just afraid of getting arrested again, but they actually develop some understanding about why they should never buy sex again, both because of the harm to others, but also because it's not working for them. You know, and because these guys are such narcissists with a small n, it really goes a long way when we're able to engage them and saying, your life will be better, you deserve healthy relationships, you deserve consensual sexual activity with people who you enjoy and who enjoy you. You know? And so this indicated a totally different type of program. You know, in the past, what we had been known as John School was generally a 20, you know, sometimes as short as a 15-minute program. You know, Chicago does a program that's 15 minutes long. If the guy can pay the fine, swipe his card, watch a video, he gets a pre-arrest diversion. How you think that you're gonna get any sort of behavioral change by watching a 15-minute video is beyond me. But I think what it speaks to is kind of the norms around the way we understand prostitution. It's less than a slap on the wrist. It's less than kind of fishing without a permit or stealing a sandwich from the corner store. You know, some of the programs are better. They're 6 hours, they're 8 hours, but still, they tend to be operating as diversion programs. They tend to be that single session. They happen in really large groups. It's a lecture format that claims effectiveness. A shotgun approach, meaning we're going to cover a bunch of different topics. We're going to tell you about the impact on the community and the neighborhood. We're going to tell you about the harm to survivors. We're going to tell you about the disease you might get, and we're going to tell you about something else. And honestly, they know about all those things already. The information-based kind of idea that this is going to change their behavior is just not indicated. What was indicated for me when I was looking at the data, when I was looking back at my work with sex buyers, is that optimally we would do something post-conviction. There would be whatever other consequences, and then they would be they would be ordered to come to the class as well. It would be multiple sessions so that we could have them in a common cohort over time. We would work with them both as individuals and in small groups of no more than 12 people with interactive exercises where they were able to relate what the content was to their individual lives and process that within the confines of the group. There were going to be clear goals around kind of what the process-based goals for the program were about. And so these were kind of the contributing kind of ideas that we had when we created the 10-week SSE curriculum. And so I want to finish up here pretty quickly because I know that there's probably questions, and I would have liked to have more time for questions and to have some more conversation about this. But basically the way it operates is that when we're partnering with communities, we need law enforcement to regularly do stings, right? If you don't have the stings, you don't have the buyers, you don't have the participants for the program. So you need a commitment from law enforcement to do periodic stings so that you can have a steady flow of people. When you're operating a program fee for service, you need to be able to count on the fact that there's going to be a steady stream of people coming through. We need to be able to have the attorneys and prosecutors be able to recommend SSE as a condition of sentence, and the judges be on board as well. For the classes itself, there's 3 process-based goals. We need to understand prostitution as a form of gender-based violence and inequality. We need to deconstruct toxic or hegemonic masculinity and explore healthy masculinities that are consistent with equality, mutuality, and consent, right? That these are the 3 kind of steps that we need to take with the buyers who come through the class. And so we take them at every level. We take them from the time that we first contact them through the individual phone session that we take as an intake with them, through a one-on-one orientation that we do with them for the class, and then through the 8 weeks of the weekly class. We're working with those same process-based goals for them. Early on in those individual sessions, we're engaging them through motivational interviewing in order to, because that was indicated by the ambivalence, right? We know the men are ambivalent, so we do MI with them in order to get them prepped to come to the class. 2 sessions of motivational interviewing, followed by the 8-week group class. The MI is incredibly effective. I did these classes for 25 years before I introduced the idea of using MI, and I wish I would have done it 24 years before, because it really does help so much. So just to kind of outline the 8 weeks of the class itself, the arc of the class starts with an exploration of gender socialization, myths of male sexuality, and the construction of sexual identity. And then we talk about women's gender socialization and prostitution as gender-based violence, along with how men are taught to view women. In week 3, we go through pornography, sexual objectification, and sexual violence continuum. The 4th week, we talk about intimate partner violence. The 5th week, we link this up with other forms of oppression and talk about how they're related to prostitution. And then weeks 6, 7, and 8, after we've deconstructed all of the harm, we really want to help them build the lives and relationships that are going to actually serve their needs and the relational needs that they're trying to get met. So we talk to them about vulnerability, shame, social support, mutuality, and consent in relationships, and then engage them in the final week with a discussion of where they go from here. The 10 weeks is a lot better than 15 minutes, but it's still only 10 weeks. And so we need to connect the men up with follow-up groups, and I can say more about that at another time. But so what we know about the class is through the evaluations that we've done. And I know Lucy has shared some of that data with you. What we know is that they say that their attitudes have changed around sexual exploitation, and they're not going to buy sex anymore. They also say that they think differently after the class than they did before. Before in the class, they thought people in prostitution like what they were doing. They thought if they gave a woman money, she should do whatever they want, that they weren't harmed, that they have a right to pay for sex, and they couldn't be raped. You see, it's a significant shift afterwards. And I think that it's important to point out too, that additionally, they said that they agreed that they would talk to other men about the negative impacts of buying sex, that they knew that it had a negative impact on their life, not just on the person who's exploited or their family, but it had a negative impact on their life and on others in their life and on people in prostitution. So what we know is that the self-assessment data suggests that the class was positive. It impacted their decision to not buy sex again. We were able to meet those 3 process-based goals of reframing prostitution, deconstructing toxic masculinity, encouraging healthy masculinities. And some quick quotes to end from men who have been through the class. This class helped me take a good long look at myself and my relationships. So I want to use this to make my relationship with my wife a mutual relationship rather than a controlling one where I'm trying to control her. I put this one up there because this particular guy actually self-referred to a domestic violence program after coming through the sex buyers class, because he was alerted to the fact that he had coercive controlling behaviors in his intimate partner relationship. This guy said, I'm going to raise my son differently because I don't want him to be angry and depressed all the time like me. This one said, I like the class, but 8 weeks is not enough. We've been in this problem for years, so 10 weeks is not enough. We need more. Right? So I think it speaks to kind of this understanding that Mary Watkins really succinctly puts. The class is about this. Once departing from those false universals around ideas about masculinity, unconscious identification with those dominant ideologies, and fixed schemas of development, an interior sense of self that finds alternative orientations becomes possible. So in a nutshell, that is what the SSC class is about. And I know that I have basically burned through all of our time. So I'll turn it over to you, Lucy.